Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Today I will be discussing a little bit of history regarding American tank development during the Second World War. And also, I will describe how these developments led towards modern tanks being what they are today. By the way, this is my first time making a history podcast, so if you like this video, then hit the like button and subscribe. Alright, so let's get started. Like any war, World War II experienced a rapid expansion towards military technology. And although tanks existed prior to World War II, beginning development in World War I, they were slow and cumbersome and very lightly armored. So they really didn't have much more use other than passing through trenches and barbed wire. So even though they were useful, they didn't play as much of a role on the battlefield as, let's say, the machine gun would. And the logistics of using these things was also very complicated because they were really heavy and really slow. However, when World War II began, Germany introduced a new set of tanks that were vastly superior to these big, cumbersome trapezoids that we're seeing in World War I. These tanks were fast, maneuverable, and they could control entire fronts with their impenetrable armor. Like dragons, these mechanical beasts became romanticized throughout war culture as they had cold rolled steel armor that was impenetrable, and their characteristics matched the descriptions of dragons, seemingly breathing fire with their giant guns. These seemingly indestructible beasts were real mechanical dragons. As with the beginning of any new war comes a new type of warfare. The machine gun was no longer the king of the battlefield as it has been in the First Great War, because since then militaries have changed and filled in the gaps that the machine gun passed through, and they filled the vulnerabilities that the machine gun had so easily exploited in the First Great War. Moreover, one of the ways that they filled this vulnerability was by the use of tanks, which were essentially giant mobile fortresses that had just enough armor to shield from whatever the opposing threats were at the time so that they could remain mobile, and they usually carried a big enough gun to destroy enemy bunkers or other armaments that they faced at the time. And whenever World War II started, because Germany was prepared for the war, they were also prepared to face other tanks because they've seen what everyone else has. And so they developed tanks that were vastly superior to the tanks of any other nationality, as they had armor that was capable of stopping small arms fire like 37 millimeter and lower, but were maneuverable enough to also outmatch the opposing little tiny tanks in regards to mobility and therefore defensive placement. Furthermore, during the start of the war, Germany was able to field 2,574 tanks. 627 of them were medium-class Panzer III and IVs, the rest being 10-ton light Panzer IIs, as well as Panzer I tanks, which is quite a force. And being that these tanks were vastly superior to these other tanks, they were seemingly unstoppable in the beginning of the war. However, as technologies advance with one country, other countries follow suit as they see these technologies as not only things opposing them, but also as potential for innovation and improvement, as they can steal the ideas from the enemy and then innovate those ideas and make themselves superior. However, prior to World War II, in order to maintain combat readiness, in 1938, General George C. Marshall approved a proposal to organize two separate armored corps, one at Fort Knox and the other at Fort Benning. These tested the new experimental concepts, sidestepping congressional approval via writing them off as service tests. This was a wise choice on his part because the war began for America 3 years after Marshall's initial service test started being conducted, which undoubtedly helped America develop tanks to combat the Germans once they saw what their opposition was. In 1942, during the Battle of El Alamein, the Americans introduced the M4 Sherman to the battlefield, armed with a 75mm cannon, which was easily able to pierce through all four of the Panzer tanks that Germany initially introduced to the battlefield. And this tank was considered a remarkable breakthrough tank. However, despite this wartime propaganda, tankers knew this tank as being a death trap because its ammo storage was located on the floor of the tank, which was not well armored. This allowed mines and fires to cook the ammo and easily set it off. This tank's armor was not well suited towards combat with other tanks because as the M4 was being introduced to the battlefield, Germany had already started developing a new 76mm high velocity cannon, which was much more effective at penetrating armor, which I'll discuss later how speed affects the penetrative power of the tank round. But anyway, the Americans also developed a 76mm round. However, the Americans didn't like it as much as the Germans liked theirs because it was a little bit bigger and took up more room in the turret, and they found issues with implementing these as they had to convert all the 75mm guns into 76mm, and that cost a lot of money and also requires some logistical feats in order to accomplish. Moreover, Britain made their own version of the 76mm M4, which they dubbed the Firefly. It was basically just the M4 that they got from the Americans, but fitted with a 17-pounder rifled barrel, and these did pretty well compared to the 75mm guns that the Americans had. Moreover, towards the end of the World War, the Americans did come out with a better tank that was way more capable than the M4 Sherman, even though the M4 Sherman did have multiple variants, some being more armored than others. And so this new tank was called the M26 Pershing, and it was only around during the last year of the war. However, it sported a 90mm high-velocity cannon that was capable of competing with the German tanks that were at the end of the World War, like the Tigers and Panthers and stuff. However, because it was at the very end of the war that they introduced it, it wouldn't really play that much of a role in the war. Despite all of this, tank technology was not simply about guns and armor. These vehicles were also used for many other things, such as clearing obstacles and stuff, because their sheer weight and mobility allowed them to act sort of like bulldozers in a sense. And during the Battle of Normandy, for example, Sherman tanks were modified with big brush bumpers that they cut up from the barriers installed on the beach fronts. These newly makeshift manufactured brush guards were used to clear the heavily brushed area upon passing the beach part of the island, which played a crucial role in progressing through the island. They also especially fitted some M4 Shermans with like a basket thing that went around them, so they were kind of like a boat, which allowed them to come directly from the invasion boat to the beach. Moreover, some Sherman tanks were also fitted with mine clearing devices in some instances. You can see in this video segment, for example, this tank was being used to clear mines so that infantry could walk through, and also so the tank doesn't blow up. These advancements in adaptive and flexible technologies regarding tanks made them play a significant role on the battlefield. After these World War II tanks had helped conquer the war, America continued to invest in tank technology, and you can see the M26 Pershing, for example, looks a lot like later iterations of the tank, such as the M46 Patton, where if you didn't know about tanks, you'd probably think they're the same exact thing. Or even the M48 and M60 Pattons, which were used during the Cold War and Korean War times. Right. The way that armor was developed only started to shift once tanks like the Abrams tanks started coming out, and the armor material shifted from being cold rolled steel to actually a composite material, which is mostly, it's like a layered ceramic sort of thing, which creates limitations on how it can be built and manufactured, and thus it also changed the entire design for what a tank looks like. And so you see modern day tanks, they all pretty much look relatively the same, with the exception being like Russian tanks, because they still have cold rolled steel armor for a lot of their tanks, and therefore they can make them round and stuff like that. But for the most part, most modern tanks are real boxy because composites can't be bended and cast the way that traditional steel can, so therefore you have to make them flat. Additionally, because the technology regarding engines and stuff changed, what is feasible for a medium tank in World War II is vastly different than what is feasible for a medium tank nowadays. For example, an M4 Sherman weighed about 30 tons, which is pretty heavy. That's 60,000 pounds. But an M1 Abrams travels faster and weighs 62 tons when it's fully loaded. So they don't even consider tanks mediums and heavies anymore. They're just main battle tanks because the technology has progressed to the point where those two roles don't exist, and the heavy tanks are actually maneuverable enough to basically be mediums. So let me get back into explaining why a high velocity gun would make a difference in the development of tank warfare, and why that was such a big deal with the Germans introducing that into the battlefield. Armor has three categories which determine its effectiveness. One is the density of the material, because it requires more energy for armor to get pushed out of the way of the projectile. Two is the speed of sound of the material, because that determines how fast energy can be dissipated throughout it so that the projectile gets defeated easier. And three is the molecular bonds in between the atoms of the material, because if those are harder to separate, then it becomes more rigid and therefore more effective. With modern armor, for example, they use a lot of ceramics because they have a really high speed of sound, and even though they're very easily fractured, they still have a really strong molecular bond, which makes it hard for the penetrator to actually go through. And it not only absorbs energy, but it spreads the energy out, because usually the projectile doesn't go straight through it, but rather shatters it and kind of like makes a big shell around it, which makes a bigger surface area for the next layer of armor to get pushed upon. Furthermore, the way a projectile works in defeating armor is basically the same principles as the way that armor works at defeating a projectile. So it's preferential to shoot higher density, harder objects at armor, because it will punch through the ceramics easier and defeat softer targets. That's why for modern armor piercing ammunition, they use steel cores often. Or in heavier calibers, they will even use tungsten and even depleted uranium, because it's such a dense and hard material. Furthermore, the speed of sound of the armor is negated by the speed of the projectile, because it takes time for energy to transfer, and the faster something goes, the less time it takes to react with the surface of the opposing material. So that's why high velocity defeats armor. You can see in this picture, I have a sabot casing, which basically shows the way that a modern tank round works. This was fired out of a M1 Abrams tank. You can see on the inside where the little ridges are, it has like little grooves, and these are for holding a metal penetrator in the middle called a sabot. The way it works is, even though this round is fired out of a really big gun, either being 105 millimeters in the case of an M1A1 Abrams, or 120 millimeter in the case of M1A2 or A3 Abrams tanks, because the actual penetrator of the round is small, it reduces the amount of surface area that comes into contact with the armor. Furthermore, by using a sabot system to project the round, it makes it so that the round itself is lighter and therefore requires less energy to actually be fired from the gun, which makes it so that the acceleration from the gunpowder is much larger, as the gas will then expand much quicker in the barrel, thus creating more velocity and a better penetrative round. These sabot systems did exist in World War II. However, they were not as well developed as the ones used in modern warfare, obviously. Alright, so to recap, tank technology during World War II had developed greatly on both sides of the conflict between the Americans and Germans, with the Americans starting off with almost really not anything, but the Germans, on the other hand, starting off with a very well developed fleet of tanks. The Americans, however, despite playing catch up for most of the war, did eventually get there, and for the most part, their tanks were still very viable on the war front. Furthermore, Americans, because of the Germans, actually started developing much better tanks. as the conflict showed Americans that the need for a really well built main battle tank was there, and it was a combat effective device to be used. Moreover, this continuation of tank development after the World War led to some interesting technologies, such as fin discarding sable rounds and really cool looking big Abrams tanks. And um, for a while, America had the only tank that was really that feasible on the battlefield because they were one of the first, along with the Britons, to come out with composite armor tanks that could essentially withstand almost any threat. It's debatable whether the tanks are still the top of the line comparative to all the other technologies because the Challenger 2, for example, is pretty cool. The Leopards that the Germans now develop and sell to other countries are also really well equipped, and pretty much every single nation is using some form of composite armor. Um, but I still think they're the best. But it's probably just because I live in America and I'm patriotic. But thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe.